y'all. Sorry I couldn't make it. I had something come up that I can't avoid, and I've done a lot of research on Scots Irish music to present to you tonight. So I am making this quick presentation via video, and I have several YouTube videos that I'm going to play for you, some clips to give you some idea of what we're talking about. I'm only going to play those in part just for time's sake, but I will send a copy of the links to Dixie if you're interested in listening to any particular video in its entirety. So we're going to talk about music in the Scots Irish, but just in case anybody's new, I want to define that term. So the Scots Irish is a term that refers to a particular migrant group of Protestant settlers who moved from Scotland to Northern Ireland in the 17th century and then subsequently migrated to the American colonies in the 18th century. The term Scots Irish is an Americanism. You really don't hear it in Ireland and the UK. There, this group of people were generally referred to as the Ulster Scots, and I'll probably use those two terms interchangeably. But when it comes to the music of the Scots Irish, it's really difficult, from my reading, I have determined, it's difficult to define exactly what is unique to the Ulster Scots, because their music and their culture within these areas overlap so much between the Irish and the Scots that there isn't, until they get to the United States, there's very little that you can sort out as unique to this group of people. So since it's this sort of complicated interweaving of factors. I really wanted it to be this nice linear course of history, but since that's not the case, I've organized this information into headings that relate to specific instruments, to dance, and to the final transition from Old World Ulster Scots music into modern day bluegrass. So let's look at some of this. So one of the first things that I read when I was beginning the process of looking up some information for this presentation was an interview with Willie Drennan, who is the head of the Ulster Scots Orchestra. He talked a lot about the ways in which so many different traditions are interwoven into Ulster Scots music. He mentions strong marching band tradition, pipe band tradition, accordion and flute bands. He also mentions the lambeg drum and fifing, but I have no idea what fifing is, and I can't find it online, so let me know if you figure out what fifing is, F-Y-F-F-I-N-G. But he refers to these things as coming from both the Irish and the Scots influence. And then he also references folk music, that's the music that would have been played in local halls and people's homes, and that's usually fiddle music, tin whistles, flutes, and drums. In that aspect, it's not significantly different than what we usually think of as Irish music, but it's essentially the melding of those two cultures. When Mr. Drennan was asked to name what he thought is the most popular song that comes straight from the Ulster Scots that he could attribute specifically to that group of people, he listed the song My Aunt Jane. So I'm going to play a few seconds of that for you.
My Aunt Jane, she took me in, she gave me tea out of her wee tin, half a bap with sugar on the top, 3 black lumps out of her wee shop, half a bap with sugar on the top, 3 black lumps out of her wee shop. My Aunt Jane, she's awful smart, she bakes me rings in an apple tart, and when Halloween comes round, presents that tart we're always found, and when Halloween comes round, presents that tart we're always found.
So that's a little bit of My Aunt Jane, which he considers to be one of the direct lines of Ulster Scot music into modern day Celtic traditions. So next, let's talk about fiddles. I'm a little biased, so I wanted to start with fiddles, obviously. So throughout the long history of migrations from Scotland, the fiddle, or the violin, was the ideal traveling instrument. Sailors could carry it, merchants could carry it. It's lightweight, it's portable, and it's highly adaptable to all different playing styles. You can use it for a dance, you can use it for a quiet solo. So it was a really versatile instrument. So it, not surprisingly, is going to follow the Ulster Scots all the way into the southern Appalachian Mountains and become a big part of bluegrass music that we'll see in a few minutes. So the fiddle, in its present form, is originally an Italian instrument. Um, from what I've read, it seems to have made it to Scotland around the end of the 16th century, and it's there that this one particular family of Italians, the Amati family, apparently trained some instrument makers in Scotland to make their own fiddles. Um, it very quickly kind of picked up this folk style music that was played in Ireland and Scotland at the time. By the 18th century, fiddles were something that seemed to be more readily available to people who were not wealthy. They became something that even working class families could potentially own one of. This is also, the 18th century, going to be the time that they refer to as the golden age of Scottish fiddling, because there are more than 1,500 tunes that are still known today that were composed at that time. However, the Reformed Church was not a fan of the fiddle because they associated, for some reason, its playing with witchcraft. It's another wariness that's going to also be seen by Baptists in the southern Appalachian Mountains, who are going to actually refer to the fiddle as the devil's instrument. But even though the church was not a fan, it still became more and more popular because it drew people together. You could use it to set the rhythm of a dance, or it could act as a centerpiece or solo instrument. You're going to see also throughout the 18th and 19th century some distinctive regional fiddle styles that are going to develop throughout Scotland and Ireland. So what we're going to look at for a minute are these three styles of fiddling, one of which that's going to become the style that's primarily attributed to the Ulster Scots. Before we get to that one, let's look first at a style of fiddling called Shetland fiddling, which is characteristically known for really fast reels that are sort of embellished with these little ornamental triplets. It's gonna, in some ways, be attributed to Scandinavian influences. So let's listen to a few seconds of Shetland fiddling. So that is an example of the Shetland style of fiddling from the Shetland area of Scotland. Next, I want to look at what is called, some people, the northeast style of fiddling. Some call it the Strathspey style. This one is going to have what most of the books that I've read consider more classical sort of underpinnings. It's going to be more based in traditional classical music. But it's also going to include these sort of slower dances, one of which is called the Strathspey, which comes from the Spey Valley, which is near Inverness. So let's listen to what the northeast fiddling style sounds more like. Alright, so that's the northeast fiddle style. But the next style of fiddling we're going to look at is the one that is primarily attributed to the Ulster Scots. This is called the Donegal style of fiddling. And it is primarily known for really short bow strokes. It's going to be known as sort of more free, less ornamented. and it's going to, in some ways and in some examples, mimic the bagpipes. It's known for these droning double strings, the kind of thing that you're going to see in more modern day bluegrass fiddles. So let's listen to some domino fiddle. So that's more typical of the domino style. Right, next, I want to talk about dancing. So dance music in the Ulster Scot tradition is going to incorporate, again, forms of Scottish dance music as well as forms of Irish dance music. And Scottish and Irish dance styles and tempo is going to vary from region to region. But the tunes are going to have some things in common. They're accessible, meaning they're relatively easily played, they're repetitive, they're cyclical, and they make you want to dance. They're catchy. Formal dance is one that's going to draw an audience who will sit and watch a performance. But most dance activities in these countries were not meant to be formal dances. They were meant to be social occasions where you drug everybody else out on the dance floor. So when you're talking about Celtic dance music, the first two things that people normally think of are jigs and reels. Um, Although you see jigs and reels in both Scotland and Ireland, it seems to be, from my reading, that jigs originated in Ireland while reels originated in Scotland. So the jig became popular in the 16th century, but most of the jigs that are common today were actually written in the 18th and 19th century. They're made to be sort of sprightly. They're played in a variety of time signatures. You can have them in 6/8, double 6/8, 9/8, 2/4. They're just fast and light and fun. Where reels, and we're going to listen to an example of each of these, reels that originated in Scotland in the middle of the 17th century are almost always played in 4/4 time. It's almost always highly, like almost exactly repeated, the same, 8 measures over and over again. And this repetition is going to give rise to a really patterned and kind of regimented dance. So if you watch the pattern of the reel versus the jig, you're going to see a little bit more regimentation between the foursome, and you're going to hear a lot more repetition than you're going to hear in the jig. So let's watch and listen to a little bit of an Irish jig. Alright, so that was our Irish jig. Now let's listen and look at the Scottish reel. I may fast forward this one a bit. It seems like it takes them a minute to get started.
But the one after is supposed to be yeah, they're up. Just call it here, that's okay. It's gonna come in late. Okay. Just call it next week.
partnered dance where a jig is usually more often but not always a solo dance. But the Ulster Scots are going to incorporate both of these kinds of dancing. Um, the Ulster Scots, from my reading, seem to be actually really known for dancing, even among the other Celtic people, especially once they immigrated to America. Because I was reading about how social status became so unimportant at that part that all of these dances were a really big deal because everyone, regardless of their standing, would be on the dance floor together. Um, they even, at the time, there are some examples of in the U.S. some old Scottish sword dancing being performed at weddings and things like that. Except they would use broomsticks or shovels or spades or something else to enact the sword dance. There's even an example I read about where one wedding party in America among the Ulster Scots recorded their dance set list, and they performed 92 jigs, 52 country dances, 45 Scottish reels, 17 hornpipes, and so it's estimated in about 5 minutes per dance. That's still 17 hours of dancing for one wedding. So they like to dance. There's actually one musicologist that I read about though that was talking about the athleticism of the dance. And here's a quote of his. He said, "There's a toughness in a lot of these dances, a strength in the music, an athleticism. These are mostly mountain people. They're fit. They've come from a country which has been defending itself for hundreds of years from a much more powerful neighbor. Never mind its own infighting. And then in Northern Ireland, they were in a similar situation. And finally, they go to America, where they're battling to make a living there. So it makes sense that their dancing would require a great deal of physicality." So that's Dr. John Purser, who's a musicologist, talking about the dancing of the Ulster Scots. All right, so let's look at the notes. Bagpipes. So you mentioned Scots Irish music, and everyone always immediately thinks of bagpipes. Um, although the bagpipes were a big part of Scottish history, and the Ulster Scots are from Scotland, there is really not that much evidence that they were as interested in bagpipe music as some of their Highland cousins would have been. They definitely did not take the bagpipe into the United States during the first few waves in the 18th century of Ulster Scot immigration. It's not going to be until later waves that they bring the Ulster pipes with them, and so a lot of what you're going to see is more in the Pennsylvania region where the Ulster Scottish pipe bands are going to be. They're not going to so much have found their way farther down into the Appalachian Mountains and into the south. But they did make it to Pennsylvania, and so here's an example of an Ulster pipe band that has been together for several generations competing in a pipe band competition in Pennsylvania. So what's interesting about these bagpipers that I was reading is that they wear what are called sort of a general Ulster tartan, but from the things that I've read, that it doesn't really make sense to me because they've talked about how their ancestors would not necessarily have worn a tartan. But this is the Ulster tartan that they have chosen to wear in the United States. So I don't know a lot about its origin. I tried to find more and I couldn't. So I'd be really interested in that to ask if maybe one of the tartan museums said something. So next we're going to talk about um, a dulcimer. But first I want to make a quick note about the harp, because I think the harp is such a stereotypical part of Scotland and Irish music, Scottish and Irish music, that I didn't want you to think I left it out completely. But from what I found, the harp really did not play a huge role in the music of the Ulster Scots. That the harp is generally thought of as an instrument of the aristocracy. That they had their professional harpers who were held in high regard, and they would come and play their, epic poetry on harp, and that the Ulster Scots kind of saw that as more of an uppity thing that they weren't interested in, and they couldn't afford harps anyway. So it was really not a huge part of their music, although it did in the 19th century as the harp was falling out of favor because the fiddle had become so prominent, and the bagpipes had become so prominent. There was a musicologist at the time whose name was Dr. Bunting, and he decided to travel all over Scotland and Ireland to try to record this harp music that was being lost. And in those travels, he did go into the Ulster region, and he did start this huge volume of Ulster tunes. They weren't harp tunes, but as he was going around trying to record that harp music, he managed to make one of the more authoritative and really important volumes of Ulster Scot music in 1809, and then in 1840 somebody went back behind him and updated it. So it's a really good source for Ulster music that came out of his desire to preserve that harp music. But we're not talking about harps, so let's look at the next thing. So Mountain Dulcimer. Once the Ulster Scots settled in America, they made use of the fact that they had gotten really good at absorbing and modifying the useful things from cultures around them. They had to do it before, and they did it again in the U.S. So from the Germans, they actually acquired a couple of things: a specific kind of long rifle that I don't know anything about, and a stringed musical instrument called the shapeholt. This shapeholt, they're then going to take into the Appalachian Mountains, and they're going to make it their own. They're going to change a little bit about its shape and a little bit about the way it's played. They like strings that drone, which is something that they picked up from the pipers. So they're going to add some droning strings, and eventually they're going to end up with what we generally call the mountain dulcimer, which comes out of the Ulster Scots tradition. So let's listen to a few minutes of the mountain dulcimer. That's a mountain dulcimer. I actually have one if anyone wants to borrow it and play around with it. The way that this lady's playing it, though, you would have to have some pretty big calluses. Most people use a wooden stick to press the strings. But anyway, if you're interested, let me know. I'd be happy to let you borrow it. So that's the mountain dulcimer that made its way into Ulster Scot music by the time that the Ulster Scots made it into the Appalachian Mountains. So now what I want to talk about the last few minutes here is something in one of the books that I read that was really a big part of the book that the authors felt like. One of the authors was actually the lady that hosts the Thistle and Shamrock, if you listen to that on NPR. This is something they thought was really not emphasized enough in music history, which is the distinction between old-time Ulster Scot music and bluegrass music. They say that a lot of times those two things get lumped together, but there's at least a century in between, because from the time that the Ulster Scots made it to the Appalachian Mountains until bluegrass became more of a style in the early 20th century. So you're talking about at least a century, if not more, where they called old time music was being played, which is much more similar to traditional Ulster Scots music. But they talk about here are the differences, just to give you an idea. So old time is the immediate descendant of the music that came across the Atlantic. It's going to get reinterpreted, but it's not going to go so far from it that we would call it bluegrass. So differences. First thing that they point out is the tempo. They say bluegrass is usually much more up tempo. It's faster than old time music, which is going to be a little more restrained tempo. Um, because the old time music is going to be used much more for dancing, and so it's going to need to have a pretty strict. It's going to have to keep the same tempo throughout the piece. Um, the second thing they talk about is instrumentation. They say that old time music emphasizes the fiddle as its lead instrument, with a distinctive kind of claw hammer accompaniment that can be supported by a guitar or a banjo, but that the fiddle is the primary instrument. Where bluegrass, they said, seems to highlight the banjo, the picked banjo, and guitar riffs more frequently than it does the fiddle. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but they're the musicologist and I'm not. They said in bluegrass sometimes even the fiddle can be replaced by the mandolin or a resonating guitar or a dobro, where in old time music it was the primary instrument. They talk about musical style. So the emphasis in old time music is much more on rhythm, where in bluegrass it's much more on the density of the notes. That old time tunes use cross tunings where they alter the pitch of the strings to have that droning that comes from the bagpipe tradition with lots of double stops, where bluegrass is going to be jazzier and swing a little more. And that old time, when the banjo is employed in old time music, it's going to be played in a more hammered style instead of the picking that you see in banjo music. They talk about the arrangements, that old time sound stresses continuous melody with couplet song overlaid for contrast, while bluegrass tunes are arranged around a lead instrument which can rotate from one player to the other. Improvisation. So old time improvisation is very narrowly focused. They are more concerned with the dance and maintaining the rhythm of the dance, where bluegrass is more based on improvisation, where there are solos, where someone comes up to the front, which leads me to performer positioning, which is one of the main differences that they talk about a lot in this one particular book. Um, they said bluegrass does what's called the microphone bob, which is that you have the group of bluegrass players and one of them is going to come up to the microphone and sort of lead for a while and then fall back, and another instrument will go up and lead for a while and then fall back. Where old time musicians would not have liked that at all. They said that the Ulster Scots preferred a stationary semicircle where they wanted to emphasize that it's about the song and not about the singer. So nobody would have wanted to come forward to sing to be a soloist. So that was really interesting, the ways in which these particular music experts saw these big distinctions between the two. So let's look at one example of each. I tried to use the example they listed in the book where I could find it. So here's an example of more old time traditional music. So that is one example, although it didn't show the importance of the fiddle that they emphasized, but this was the example that they used in the book, so I used it with you. Let's look at some. I don't know what bluegrass sounds like, but let's listen to their example for what is bluegrass, not old style, but came through from the Ulster Scots tradition. Alright, so that was an example that they gave of what bluegrass sounded like after it moved from this more traditional style. So in my reading, just to wrap up, um, I will say one of the other interesting things that I saw or listened to while I was doing this research is how in the songs that were directly attributed to the Ulster Scots, you see the same themes pop up again and again. One of them obviously being whiskey, which we talked about last week, and what an important part whiskey is played in their culture and their economy. Another thing that you see a lot is the concept of missing a homeland that's far away, which is obviously would be an important part of Ulster Scots culture. They had been driven from homes more than once. And even a lot of the songs were used in what was called an American wake that I read about, which is sort of the last party they had before someone went to move to America. They call it a wake because they were unlikely to ever see that person again. So it was kind of a final farewell, and a lot of the traditional Ulster songs come out of this concept of an American wake. And then the third thing that I saw a lot of was unrequited love, um, which I thought was interesting because I was reading chapters about how there was a lot of pressure among the Ulster Scots and the Scots Irish in America not to marry outside of their group. They were, in Ireland, they were Protestants and surrounded by Catholics. You just didn't marry outside of that. So a lot of their songs have to do with someone who loves someone that their parents are not okay with. So I thought that was interesting, and I saw that several times. But finally, I want to leave you with a quote from a musicologist named Frank Clark, who studies Ulster Scott musical tradition. He said, "Those in power write the history, while those who suffer write the songs. And given our history, we have an awful lot of songs." And I think that's probably the best way that I can sum up the music of the Ulster Scots. So thank you guys, and I hope to see you next month.